Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gerken. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we're going to talk about deer, but we're going to talk about what deer are eating this time of year, Drew. And so I think we're going to focus on some oak trees and what they're producing. I think the biggest question, just get it out of the way right away, is it acorn or is it acorns that we're talking about today?
You know, I find myself pronouncing it differently depending on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to somebody from the southeastern U.S., I intentionally say acorn so that they don't make fun of me. If I'm talking to folks maybe out in the Great Plains and stuff, I tend to say acorn. So
a little regional dialect is always good, right?
Yeah.
So we're thinking about these acorns and mainly deer, but why are we talking about them today?
Well, it's deer season. We've been hunting deer in Kansas since mid-September, basically. It's early December now. We've just come through the peak of rut activity in Kansas, and during that time, bucks are basically 100% focused on reproducing, and so they're spending all their time chasing does, trying to find does, tending those does to try and make sure another buck doesn't get them bred after they've run them until they're tired. And they can lose an incredible amount of weight during that time period because that's all they're thinking about is running around chasing does. It's kind of like, if we were playing football 100% of the time for 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah. So 25 to 30% of their body mass they can lose during that period.
You told me that, and I asked if it was a typo because it just seems like a crazy amount. But that's a lot. Are the does losing any weight too, or is that mainly the bucks that are losing that body mass?
I'm sure that they're losing some because they're being chased around a lot when they're in heat. I don't have a number for that, but I'm sure that it's a stressful time period for them, just not as stressful for them as it is for the bucks.
Sure. So they're spending a lot of energy out there, right? And so that probably is changing their eating habits or feeding habits to some degree. Maybe they don't eat at all. They're just too busy chasing those does. So what's going on with what they're eating?
Well, they don't eat nearly as much, or they don't spend as much time eating as they do during the other times of the year. So when they do eat, they need something that's got a whole bunch of energy in it. And we're thinking about energy in the form of carbohydrates and fats is what's really, really important for them to just get some energy back in their body. And then once that rut period is over, having foods that are really high in energy, not focusing so much on protein like they do at other times of the year. Really high energy demands. And that's why we see a lot of deer eating corn during this time of the year. We also see deer eating lots and lots of acorns when they're available. And we'll kind of talk about that availability a little bit more as we go on. But, acorns tend to drop in the fall through the winter, and it lines up pretty well. The acorn drop lines up pretty well with when the white-tailed deer are needing that really high carbohydrate, really high fat resource to eat.
So not a lot of protein in acorns, but really good in the carbohydrates and the fats. Give them kind of a quick little burst of energy, but nothing maybe long-term.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, acorns are going to be 4 to 5% crude protein, about 10% carbohydrates, basically 85% total digestible nutrients in every acorn that a deer eats. So.
And are they the only critter that are eating these acorns, or the main critter, or what are these acorns being eaten by other critters?
Acorns are a really important resource, I don't want to say they're a really important resource because there's sometimes when there's no acorns around, right? But when they're available, they're selected by lots of different critters. So of course, squirrels we think about as a critter that's eating lots of nuts. Raccoons eat a lot of acorns. That's a species we may not think about so much. Turkeys, woodpeckers, ducks. When we've got flooded timber, that's one of the main things ducks are eating if they're out in that flooded timber. Things like blue jays. I'm having a little bit of a brain fart there. Lots of different birds that eat seeds, but that have a big enough mouth that they can eat a larger nut, but on the smaller end of the acorn size. So like the little red oak acorns, maybe a chinkapin acorn if we're thinking about white oak acorns and stuff like that.
Yeah, so white oak and red oak. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that means and maybe how that lines up with the acorn size or flavor perhaps? So tell us a little bit about those two groups here.
Sure. So we've got two different groups of oaks, and some of the species are in the white oak group, and some of the species are in the red oak group. And if we're thinking about how to tell the difference, the easiest way to tell is to look at the leaves. And if you think about an oak leaf having different lobes on it, some of them are really pointy lobes, some of them are really rounded lobes, but on the end of those lobes, each lobe of the leaf, if it's got bristles on it, then it's in the red oak group. So species in that group that are common in Kansas would be northern red oaks, pin oaks, black oaks, shoe-marred oaks, and those kind of species. The white oaks don't have those bristles on the end of the lobes, and really common oaks in that group would be white oaks, swamp white oaks, bur oaks would be the most widespread in Kansas. They go way out west. I've seen them out like in Rooks County. So 2/3 of the way through the state, they're a common oak species out there. But there's quite a few of them. Oaks, the bur oaks have the largest acorns. Sometimes those things are almost as big as a golf ball. But we see some interesting similarities and differences between those oaks from the characteristics that matter to critters. A critter doesn't matter if it's a red oak or a white oak, right? But white oaks have lower tannin content. So lots of plants have defense mechanisms that are designed to keep critters from eating their vegetation or maybe eating too many of the acorns and stuff like that. So tannins or tannic acid is one of those compounds that is a defense mechanism. And the red oaks tend to have higher tannins, which would be something that would taste bitter to us. They tend to have higher tannins than the white oaks. So the white oaks are more palatable, and they're selected by most wildlife species over the red oaks. Red oaks are still selected when they're available, but the white oaks are a little bit more palatable, so they're going to be higher in that sort of selection range. Another interesting difference about them is that white oaks are going to put acorns on this fall from the flowers that were fertilized this last spring. So it takes one growing season for those acorns to mature. Red oaks, on the other hand, it takes a couple of growing seasons. So the flowers this year are going to produce acorns not this coming fall, but the following fall. And the reason that is important to understand is that if we have, let's say, a really late frost this year, then that might end up killing all of the fertilized flowers on the white oak trees. It's going to kill all the fertilized flowers from this year on the red oak trees too, potentially. But we can still have acorns that are produced by the red oaks this year from the flowers that they had last year. And so that can help have more of a stable acorn crop through time if that's something that we're going to try and put an emphasis on from a management standpoint.
I've heard that those tannins, and I don't know if there's any truth to this, but that red oaks having higher tannins in their acorns helps them to last a little bit longer before they go bad. Is there any truth to that you know of?
I don't know. That very well could be. It's not something that I know off the top of my head, though. Yeah. It's probably something I should have looked up before.
Well, maybe we can take that out. But
no,
it's an interesting question there. So, thinking about the crops balancing each other out. So it's just good that kind of helps protect that diversity. So there's always going to be some acorn mast every year, and tell us a little bit maybe about a mast. We talked a little bit about food or the production aspect of the acorns, but how does the total mast kind of vary year to year? Do they balance each other out, or are there changes there? Maybe even tell us what mast is, I guess.
Yeah, that's probably important. I say that word so often that I forget to define it sometimes. But basically, mast is the fruits and nuts and other sorts of seeds that are produced by woody plants. So soft mast would be things like persimmons, mulberries, blackberries, that sort of stuff. Whereas hard mast is things that we would typically call nuts, pecans, walnuts, acorns, and that sort of thing. So mast is nuts and fruits that come from vines, shrubs, and trees.
And so are the acorn masts, are they changing year to year? Do we see, pretty consistent amounts every year?
It varies drastically. So the studies that look at this show, and really, if we walk around and we pay attention to the oaks out there, if you pay much attention to it from year to year, you can see this too without ever even measuring it. But we have years that can be total mast failures for the oak trees, and then we can have bumper years where in a mast failure, and I don't know what the numbers are, right? But thinking about a graph, in a mast failure year, you might have 0, so there may be no bar there at all. But in a bumper year, you might have 100. On whatever that scale is, right? And so the differences in those bars can be incredibly high. You could fill several bushel baskets below not a very big white oak tree full of acorns in a bumper year, but next year there might be 0 acorns underneath of it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought there too, because it seems like when I'm walking around looking at trees that, there's a few trees that make a lot of acorns, and then others that are the same species just seem like they're not doing much at all. So is that common that some species will have a good year and others, are basically producing nothing?
Yeah. So individuals within the same species of tree, the production between those can be as drastic as the differences in production among years for the same individual. There's a study out of Tennessee that looked at this, and they found that 40% of the trees can produce 70% of the acorns. So that's how drastic the variation is among individuals. And those trees that are good producers are going to be the trees that produce acorns in good years every time, and the trees that are poor producers are always going to be poor producers.
Sure. So, thinking about, are there things I can do to that tree? Can I add fertilizer, for example, to increase the amount of acorns that I'm getting?
Yeah, you can do things. And that fertilizer recommendation, that's a really intuitive thing to us, because, if you want to grow more tomatoes, and you want to grow bigger tomatoes, and you want to grow tomatoes that maybe have better flavor, then fertilizing might be an appropriate thing to do in that situation.
You're setting this up to tell me I'm wrong again here.
I might be. I might be. Yeah, but it's a super common thing for us to do. If we want to produce more of anything, putting fertilizer on it makes sense. And it's one of the things that fertilizer companies have recommended. It's a very common recommendation that wildlife habitat consultants will often give folks when they look at properties. The first wildlife habitat management plan that I looked at that was produced by a consultant way back when I started doing habitat management for a living a long time ago, the producer that we were working with handed me a plan that somebody else had written, and I looked at it and I said, fertilize your oak trees. Well, that's not something I've ever seen anybody recommend, but it's really common. And so these folks out of Tennessee that did this study, that's one of the things that they looked at. So long story short, they found that fertilizer had no effect on the number of acorns that were produced by trees. It didn't affect the size of acorns. It didn't affect acorn quality. There was a significant difference in the amount of protein that was available in those acorns, but it was like between 4 and 5%.
Sure.
And that wasn't enough of a difference that critters ate the acorns from fertilized trees more than they ate the acorns from trees that weren't fertilized. So long story short, you can do things, but fertilizing is not the answer.
So what are those other things that maybe we can do?
The really important thing that study found was that giving oak trees more space to grow and reducing the competition that they have with other trees for resources can increase acorn production by 65%.
Wow.
So the practice that they looked at is called crown release. And the way to think about crown release and why we might want to do it is, we've got lots of forest that is getting really, really, really dense. There's not very much sunlight that makes it down through that canopy and hits the ground below trees. And there's also a lot of competition between adjacent trees for light because they're too close together. They're not spaced far enough apart. So if we were going to go in and use crown release as a habitat management practice, we would identify the trees that we wanted to keep, and then basically the diameter of the canopy of that tree, all the way around that tree, we're going to kill any tree that's in that shadow.
Oh, wow.
And you may not kill it. You may cut it down and let it re-sprout from the stump. I don't know if we've talked about that practice before in here. I know I talk about it a lot in different classes, but that's mineral stumps is what we would call that. And you get really, really high nutrient density in the browse that sprouts back on those stumps. And so that's a way to increase the quality of the woody browse that you have that's growing where there used to be a tall tree that wasn't probably providing browse down where deer and other critters could utilize it. But all that sunlight that's hitting the ground is also going to produce lots more forbs, lots more grass, all kinds of cover that's also food for a lot of different species of wildlife. But at the same time, it's letting the crown of that tree get bigger and bigger. And acorns are produced out on the tips of those branches. So, and so are the leaves that gather sunlight. So we're getting a lot more sunlight to that tree, and then it's also expanding its crown so that it can produce more, it's got more surface area to produce acorns on.
Yeah, so, that's an interesting idea there. And it takes quite a few in some really dense forest. You have to cut down or girdle quite a few trees in a lot of cases. I think it's surprising to people when you start to talk about what you want to do. They're it's just a lot more than they think about. So if I wanted to go out to a forest or to my land and figure out which trees to save, where would I start, or how would I begin that process?
Sure. First, I wanted to say something about what you said about how surprising it is about how many trees you might have to remove. If we're not managing for timber production from a forest product standpoint, but if we're managing for wildlife habitat, it tends to be that somewhere between 20% and 40%, and generally more towards 20% canopy cover is what we're looking for in that woodland.
Oh, wow.
So if you were standing not directly below a tree, but just standing in that forest and looking up, if the sky's blue, then somewhere between 60 and 80% blue sky is what you're looking for.
Wow.
And that's not what a lot of people think about when they think about woods.
No, not at all. And that seems almost overwhelming again. That's a lot of trees that I might have to go in and figure out how to manage there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But getting back to your question, so you asked how you would go about doing that canopy release. And the first step is going to be identifying your good producing trees. And the way that we're going to do that is just go out, walk around the woods, maybe take binoculars with you, which sounds like a weird thing to do if you're going to go count acorns. But if you're going out during a time of the year when the acorns are still up in the trees, they haven't fallen yet, then taking binoculars with you, counting the number of acorns within a certain number of square feet, let's say a 10 square foot area on that tree, and doing that across the area that you're wanting to manage for all the different oak trees. Making sure to do this for both some red oaks and some white oaks if you have both kinds. That way you can identify good producing trees of both groups. The other thing you could do, of course, is go out sometime between October and early December and look at the acorns that are on the ground. But keep in mind that some trees are going to drop their acorns earlier than others, so looking at what's on the branches is also going to be important.
Does the number of acorns, I tend to think about, like, I want a straight tree that has a really pretty crown on it, but it sounds like maybe that's not the best approach. Maybe looking at what they're producing is more important. Is that that accurate, or are both important?
It absolutely depends on what your goals are.
Sure.
If you're wanting to produce pretty trees, if you're wanting to use lumber production as a secondary purpose, or maybe the primary purpose, and wildlife as a secondary purpose of that timber patch, then those sort of characteristics are going to be maybe the first thing that you look at when you're thinking about selecting trees. But specifically, if we're thinking about acorn production, we want to identify those high producing trees.
What about, thinking about other species too? So it's not just going to be oaks that are in this forest. Is there any value in keeping, a mulberry tree or hackberry tree or anything like that? Or do we want to tend to try to keep oaks whenever we can from a wildlife perspective?
Diversity is important, regardless of what critter you're thinking about. Diversity is always important. When I tend to think about the focal species that I'm managing for the most when I'm thinking about these kind of projects. And so if white-tailed deer is my focal species, or even white-tailed deer and turkeys are the focal species, then I'm going to have some things that I do for each species of tree that I run into. The hackberries, those hackberry seeds, they're eaten by lots and lots of different critters. And turkeys would be one of the critters that eat some hackberry seeds. It's not a really important food source for them, but it's something that they benefit from. The white-tailed deer benefit from the browse that hackberries produce. And it's that with the hackberries in the forest in Kansas, I don't necessarily see really heavy browsing on that first growth hackberry. But if we stump sprout one of those hackberries, the deer keep that thing pruned back like a little bonsai tree for a bunch of years. So as long as we have plenty of other trees that might have more value, then those hackberries, as many as I can, I'm probably going to either cut off and let stump sprout or girdle, so that that value of the snag is still there, or that dead standing tree. That's going to produce, feeding areas for woodpeckers, homes for woodpeckers and wood ducks and raccoons and all kinds of critters. So always think about all those other species, but we tend to have priority species that we're managing for. I wouldn't get rid of all the mulberry trees. I'd keep some good mulberry trees, but I would start by focusing on those good oak trees, those ones that are good producers. And remember, you're only going to have a good mast year maybe 2 out of 5 years. So you should be doing your acorn surveys for at least 3 years probably before you go out and do any cutting, if we're thinking about releasing the crowns of oaks. And when we do that crown release, the place to start, because, of course, you got limited time, you got limited resources, the place to start would be going to those best producing trees that are surrounded not by other oak trees probably, but by less desirable tree species, or tree species that their characteristics are more favorable to wildlife if they're cut off and allowed to resprout, like some of the elms and hackberries and that sort of thing.
So it seems like a good, just a good management plan, like everything else we've talked about. Kind of look at your situation, come up with what your goals are, and then your management techniques might vary a little bit based on that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So if we're thinking about, a management plan to look at the types of trees that we have, you just mentioned some good information about which trees we might keep or might cut down, but and getting rid of a lot of oaks. It sounds there are a lot of trees, generally is needed so that you can open up that canopy. But, is it possible to have too much of a good thing, too many oak trees in your forest?
Yeah, it absolutely is, especially when the canopy's really, really dense, or if you've got oak trees stacked on top of oak trees, right? And one of the things that I run into, and I grew up in a part of the state where this culture is really common, but that this idea that oak trees are too valuable to cut down. We're only a couple generations removed from a lot of Kansas being settled. And so a lot of the settlers experience the fact that when you come in and you cut down an oak forest for firewood and for other wood products, it takes a long time, probably a generation, before you're going to have those big mature trees again. And it gets ingrained into folks that an oak tree is too valuable to cut because it takes so long to replace. But the reality is that you can absolutely have too many of them in a small area. And, we wouldn't want to go into a nice oak hickory woodland and clear cut it if we were managing for wildlife habitat. But doing some selective cutting and removing specific trees is a very, very important management tool, especially when it allows the good trees, whatever a good tree is, right? Maybe it's a good tree is a straight trunked oak tree that has a nice big crown that's a little bit crowded out, and it's the ideal producer too, right? That's the ideal oak tree. But it also may be a crooked old chinkapin oak growing out of the side of a hill that produces 10 times as many acorns as any of the trees around it. And we go ahead and cut a few of the oak trees that are crowding it out to give it a better chance too. So you always want to have a plan, and that's something that you do a really good job of stating in these episodes that I don't think I do a good enough job about. But anytime we're managing, we need to think about what our goals are. We need to do some sort of evaluation of either the population of critters that we're managing or the habitat characteristics that we're looking for, develop our management strategy based on that evaluation, then come back and evaluate whether or not we were successful, then develop our next set of goals, do another evaluation, come up with a plan, and just continue that circular process, because any sort of wildlife management or fish management, it's going to be a continual process. Very, very little is a one and done kind of deal.
Yeah, I tell people all the time that it's a journey, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to try to make steps towards improving what we want to, but you're not going to, if this is the type of thing you enjoy doing, you're never going to get to the finish line, because there's always going to be, something that you want to keep trying to improve. But enjoying that process is also really, really part of it. Thinking about trees, I don't really do this, but you started out talking about, deer, and it's kind of thinking about doe harvest or thinking about harvesting fish from a pond. Like, sometimes you have to get rid of too many animals or plants in order to help the ones that we want, the desirable ones, flourish. So kind of just a fun little analogy in my mind to bring that all together, that, hey, even sometimes the quote-unquote pretty oaks might need to go away if that means that a more valuable or prettier one can then thrive. So just an important or cool way to think about things, to think about forest management. So what else, Drew? What else are we talking about today?
Well, you brought up something. Any time we manage habitat, I think it's also important to think about, if we are attracting more critters to that spot, or if we are producing more critters from that spot. Let's also think about managing that population. And one of our bigger challenges, especially in the eastern third of Kansas, where we have lots of oak woodlands and relatively high deer densities, is there can be a lot of management going on and very little harvest, because folks are really focused on harvesting those bucks. And unfortunately, that oftentimes creates a bad situation for the neighbors who may have soybean fields or corn fields or wheat fields, and they're feeding all these deer that are either being attracted to a spot where there's lots of management going on, or that are being produced from that spot. And always remember that if we have a growing deer population, you need to harvest about a third of the does every year in order to stabilize that population.
Wow. And
there is very, very little area in Kansas where we're seeing the doe harvest that we need to be seeing to stabilize those white-tailed deer populations, where we have a lot of management going on. Further west, there's fewer and fewer deer. The deer density gets lower, but they also become more and more concentrated as you go further and further west too, because those whitetails are really concentrated around the cover. But we need to be harvesting those does. That's a really important part too. Don't just harvest the bucks.
I'm going to elaborate slightly on that, because I've had some people concerned that, if I start killing does, the population's gonna crash on me. And I think part of that might go back to the duck hunting mentality. If you shoot a hen that, the population of the ducks is going to decrease. So is there any truth to that? If I start harvesting does, is my population going to plummet? What kind of things quickly might we see if we add that to our management regime?
Well, I think the important thing that I already said that I'll reiterate is you need to be harvesting 30% of your does.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely not going to crash your population, and that mentality actually goes back to the eastern United States. Historically, we had these major declines in lots of our game species, including deer, because of overharvest. And the traditional management strategies for harvesting white-tailed deer in the eastern U.S. focused on male harvest rather than female harvest. And that ended up shifting these populations as they recovered into a state really of overpopulation, and having sex ratios that are more and more skewed toward female deer than male deer. And one of the reasons that it's absolutely not the only reason, but one of the reasons that Kansas has always had large white-tailed deer is because the emphasis of the harvest from a tag standpoint and from a season standpoint has always been towards harvesting does more than harvesting bucks. So you're absolutely not going to see a population crash if you start harvesting does, especially at the rate that really most of us are going to be able to harvest does at. I mean, I shoot 4 antlerless deer in an average year. Yeah. I'm different than most people. I'm shooting deer to eat them, not because I'm out there chasing antlers. And you absolutely see no impact on the properties that I'm hunting by harvesting that many white-tailed deer. But there are really good ways to do surveys that will allow you to figure out, number one, what's your deer density? Number two, what are your buck to doe ratios? What are your what's your fawn recruitment? How many fawns are recruited per doe every year? And from that data, then you can really start to make informed decisions about how to harvest. The University of Missouri has an extension publication that does a really good job of explaining how to do that survey that you can get that data from. And I encourage everybody to go check that out and do that survey if you really want to start making informed decisions about your harvest.
Sure. Well, maybe that's something we can elaborate on in another episode. But, thinking about today, talked a lot about acorns, a lot about feed and forest management, I think is a really important and probably underutilized tool that we have in our tool bag. So great topic today, Drew, and thanks for chatting about that.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're always glad to have you listening to us. Go check us out on YouTube. We're putting up a lot of little videos there. Danny is doing a great job of putting out resources that can really help our listeners dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that we're talking about on here. As always, please give us a review and help us continue growing our audience. And we'll check back with you in a couple weeks. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.